Ravenlok is not a bad game, but it was definitely not for me. This game was so clearly made for a specific audience that it feels necessary to contextualize that alongside my own personal criticisms. So, who is this game for? Based on its fairy tale aesthetic, ease of exploration and combat, and straightforward storytelling, I would say that it's primarily for kids. Though as usual with kids games, it's accessible in a way that works for adults who didn't grow up playing video games too. Every aspect of the game is there to guide you, from the semi-fixed camera angle to the extremely forgiving enemy encounters. Although Ravenlok obviously draws from the action RPG genre, it keeps its action on rails, guiding the player through its various systems with the presumption that the player isn't familiar with the conventions of modern video games. Like I said, this didn't work for me, but I recognize that there's an audience for whom this game was purpose-built, and I'll keep that in consideration as I detail my own experience playing it. Ravenlok is a fantasy of escapism almost explicitly in the same vein as Alice in Wonderland, though the many references are mostly superficial and limited to the imagery. There's a Queen of Hearts, playing card guards, white rabbits, mushrooms, and tea sets. Retelling classic stories is fine, but it becomes a problem for me when the retelling is reductive, that is, when it waters down the original. From the beginning, I got the sense that this world is not nearly as developed as its inspirations, with the game struggling to give me a specific sense of identity. The game opens with a slice of life section that establishes the protagonist, Kira, as a generous and earnest character, very much in the style of a Studio Ghibli lead, as she helps her parents move into their new farmhouse. It's clear what kind of character she's supposed to be, but not what specific character she is. She gets pulled from her mundane reality through a mirror, again in the same vein as Alice in Wonderland, where she's dubbed Ravenlok, and revealed to be a hero from a prophecy come to save a magical kingdom of animals from the corruption of the evil Caterpillar Queen. This is the first major deviation from Alice in Wonderland, and it's why I said that the references are superficial. Ravenlok is here to be a hero and save the kingdom, rather than to learn anything and grow as a character. One could argue that she's archetypal, so that the player can insert themselves into the fantasy, but apart from the art design, the game lacks identity across the board. It's not as if it's just this one character that has this issue. It might be immersive for a kid, but the world isn't compelling in a way that allows me to lose myself in it. I won't take away from the visual achievement though. The characters you meet along your quest are charming and beautifully designed, each model built from a dense pixelated art style that appears intricate up close and all but disappears when you move away, resulting in a style that transitions smoothly to and from pixel art. Despite the personality that comes through in the character designs though, the characters themselves are pretty one-dimensional. They each have their quirks, but little depth and no development. At the end of the day, they're here to urge Ravenlok forward on her quest. This was pretty disappointing, since characters as visually fleshed out as these deserve writing that's equally as impressive. It's an opportunity, in a fantasy of escapism like this, to give the protagonist and the player a genuine desire to save this endangered world. Instead, we get little more than cookie-cutter NPCs that aren't emotionally compelling. They're kinda just there to look cute and fit the fairy tale aesthetic. I understand that the plot isn't trying to be all that complex, it wants to be optimistic and to have a moral at the end of it for the kids playing. But Alice in Wonderland is also a children's story, and that story holds up for adults, in part because of its eccentric, interesting characters. On the other hand, Ravenlok's NPCs all just sort of blur together, all of them talking with basically the same voice. It's sort of passable for kids, but not at all memorable for me. Without getting into spoilers, I have a specific gripe about the plot. At one point close to the end, it feigns character development for Ravenlok. She realizes that she's grown attached to this magical realm and isn't so eager to leave it. She wants to be sure that it'll be safe when she finally returns home. My issue is that nothing she did or said ever suggested otherwise. She was always completely willing to help others and fulfill her role as the hero in the aforementioned prophecy. For most of my playthrough, it was clear that character development was not the game's goal, so it irks me that out of nowhere, it pretends that Ravenlok underwent some kind of substantial mindset change. The game controls exploration to a large degree, since you only ever have one way forward despite the illusion of multiple paths. Most of those paths actually lead to temporary dead ends that require the player to do something elsewhere in order to open them up. Even though I recognized this very conventional pattern early on, it didn't feel overly simplistic and linear to me. There were enough ways to go at any given time that I wasn't always sure which one would open up to me next, and which I would have to keep waiting on. The game creates an illusion of freedom and openness despite its linearity, without being so complex that kids would have trouble navigating the levels. The NPCs are always there to remind you exactly where to go and what you need items for. It was sometimes simple and predictable for me, but for a kid or a newcomer to video games, this degree of guidance would probably be welcome. It would be useful in teaching those audiences the basic rules of video game traversal, that is, how NPCs function as a means of moving the plot forward, and how items work as keys to opening up new areas of the map. Those gameplay loops are fairly straightforward, and again, conventional. NPCs often have quests for you that range from killing certain enemy types to finding particular items. For example, early into the game, I met a mouse chef that wanted an ingredient to use in a dish. In exchange, they rewarded me with an item that I needed elsewhere, in this case, a clock hand. That's essentially what you do to progress, and the game constantly reminded me of what I needed items for in case I forgot. It's simple and a bit repetitive, but it makes sense structurally for the target audience, and like I said, it would be useful for teaching newcomers this very tried and true exploration loop in video games. It never really gets more complicated than that. You don't have to do the work of figuring out what an item is for or how to use it, because the game does that for you. Although there are puzzles you have to solve throughout the game, this is not one of them. The game has no need for further complicating that model of exploration. After playing several Resident Evil games and various point-and-click puzzle games like Rusty Lake Hotel, in which it's part of the challenge to figure out what items are for, this was a bit too easy for me, but it's hard to fault the game for that when it's so clear that it's not trying to emulate that kind of design. Speaking of puzzles, the game has a few scattered throughout, none of which have particularly challenging premises. Rather than involving the items you find, these are environmental puzzles, isolated to specific spaces that serve to open the way forward. This kind of design makes sense. Everything you need to solve them is right there in that space with you. Kids or people playing video games for the first time won't have to think about anything that isn't there in front of them. They won't have to combine the different systems of gameplay and think about how their items could help, or whether they need to backtrack, or anything along those lines. As such, I generally didn't struggle with them, and even though they were underwhelming, I don't feel like that's a knock on the game. The puzzles are clearly designed for kids, and to that end, I think they succeed. The game has a semi-fixed camera, which is an unusual choice for a third-person action game by today's standards. You have some freedom in pointing the camera, but not much. You can turn it slightly to each side, but eventually it hits an invisible frame that keeps you from looking further. There's no turning it around completely to see what's behind you. It's actually a good example of how the game works as a whole, since it takes away some responsibility from the player, preferring to assist them through the rules of gameplay. Rather than making the player control their own perspective, the game chooses to maintain that control, the camera swiveling and tracking the protagonist automatically without input. It's an interesting choice that I imagine would flatten the learning curve of controlling character movement and the camera simultaneously. It'll probably be an unwelcome restraint for anyone who's already learned it, as it was for me, but it makes sense for what the game's trying to be. The upside to the fixed camera angle is that environments always felt carefully crafted for the player to see from this one perspective. They're full of picturesque locations that wouldn't feel quite as magical if you could just turn the camera away from them, or look at them from a different angle. Early in the game, for instance, you come upon a giant cat sitting by a cliff, and as you approach him to hear what he has to say, the land falls away before you to reveal a vast maze, the camera perfectly angled to capture the landscape's grandeur. There are a lot of moments like this, like when you first come upon the Queen's Castle, or anytime you find a relic. Keeping the player from having freedom of perspective results in some really spectacular views. The combat in Ravenlok is simple and forgiving, and even though that makes sense in the context of this game's ethos, I found it to be repetitive and uninteresting. Your primary attack, a sword slash, is fast but weak, so I had to spam it in between special attacks. It feels flimsy, and the animation and sound effects don't do anything to help. They sound like you're hitting a tin can with a spoon. I get that it wouldn't fit with the aesthetic to have incredibly visceral hit animations and abrasive impact noise, but it meant that for me, combat just wasn't compelling. I would hit an enemy a bunch, dash around a bit to avoid being hit, then go back in to hit them some more. Not a very deep combat framework. Enemies are damage sponges, with most of the difficulty not coming from their movesets, which are typically very simple and don't require you to engage them in specific ways, but rather from the sheer amount of health they have. I don't mean to say this game is hard. Combat never became overwhelming for me, since attacking enemies keeps their own attack animations from starting for a few seconds, which means timing and taking damage aren't big concerns. The difficulty of large health bars is cancelled out by enemies that aren't all that aggressive. Still, the way it all comes together, the enemy movesets, attack animations, big health bars, means that combat encounters don't feel all that different between enemy types. They start to feel monotonous real quick. You unlock special attacks as you progress through the campaign, and these change things up a bit, but not enough to fundamentally change the combat experience. There's a projectile ice attack that automatically targets nearby enemies, an offensive dash, a fiery slam, and a flurry of slashes, each of which require charging time to use again. I ended up alternating between them. As 3 of them charged up, 1 would become available, and so on. I just didn't find the combat model to be particularly engaging when most of what I had to do was watch the charge gauges and use abilities based on what was available. Certain attacks were not obviously better suited for certain enemies, so I didn't have to think about which attack would be most appropriate. And again, it doesn't seem like it's the game's goal to have that level of complexity. In order to appeal to its target audience, it isn't interested in demanding strategy and consideration from the player. It just wants them to press the attack buttons a bunch and maybe dash a bit for good measure. That's why it might work for some, but it didn't really work for me. Despite not being totally in love with this game, it had its moments of charm. I loved the detailed, pixelated art style, the gorgeous lighting, and the variety of environments. The actual experience of playing it, however, was underwhelming and unmemorable. Still, I can see how it's better suited for a different type of player. That is, a player who's learning the conventions of video games for the first time, who won't mind a straightforward story and simplistic gameplay. This isn't a game made to overwhelm you, but rather to guide you through and teach you some of the most well-established rules in gaming. Like I said before, it seems aimed towards kids and newcomers alike, and I'm sure those groups of people will get more out of it than I did. So what do you think? Does Ravenlok succeed at being an entry point to video games? Does it have any appeal beyond that? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed my review, consider leaving a like. I'm excited to keep making videos like this one on a fairly regular basis, so subscribe if you're interested in staying updated. Thanks for watching.